Hey everyone, it's Jackoff, and I'm back again for another video in my series, Units of Total War Rise of Mordor. Today we're going to be looking at a new faction, or should I say a different faction, because I think it's been in the game for quite a while, and that is the Dunlending Tribes. As I did promise before, this time the faction that I've chosen will be quite a full one with many units in its roster, and this one has 20 units in its roster. So I believe that's quite enough units for me to talk about for today. Now, before we start looking at the actual units themselves, let's talk about the actual faction. Also, its history, what it's based off of in real life, and its history within Middle-earth itself. So, in the Lord of the Rings movies, Dunland and its people do make an appearance, although I'm not too sure if they make an appearance only in the extended cut of the films, in the Two Towers, when Saruman raises a rabble of them to attack and burn the villages of Rohan, along with some of his lower-ranking Uruk-hai, like his marauders and all those types of troops. In the books, you get a lot more insight into who these people are, what their motives are. So you find out that the Dunlendings are the original inhabitants of the area of Rohan, similar to the Pukul men in the books who live in the forests of Gondor. Now, these people are middlemen, which is to say that they're not evil in the same way as people like the Easterlings or the Haradrim tend to be, but they're not good, not on the side of the Valar in the same way that the people of Numenor and their descendants, like the Arnorians and the Gondorians, are. This faction has many grievances with the people of Middle-earth, specifically the Rohirrim, because when Gondor created the Kingdom of Rohan by giving the land of its northern province of Calenardan to the ancestors of the Rohirrim, the Eothed, I think is what they're called, and their leader Eorl. When they were given their land, the people who had already lived there and who had been forced off of their land in turn by the Gondorians thousands of years before lost their land again to new people settling it. So they've always harboured a dislike for the people of Rohan and, by extension, the people of Gondor, because they've been forced to give up their ancestral lands to these newer kingdoms. Now, one thing that happens more so in the books, but I think we're also going to see it in the films, now that they're releasing the War of the Rohirrim animated film, is that the Dunlendings and the Rohirrim fought many stretched out conflicts, including the War of Helm Hammerhand, the guy who Helm's Deep is named after. Him fighting a very long and stretched out war against the Rohirrim, against the Dunland. That's kind of the history of their faction within the history of Middle-earth itself, as far as I know. There might be more to it, and if there is, I'd like people to tell me about it all in the comments below. Now, as for the actual history of what they're based off of in the films and the books, you could kind of consider them akin to the barbarian peoples of Europe in the face of expansionist empires like Rome. They're definitely depicted in the films more like, how would I describe it? Kind of like the way the Scots are depicted in Braveheart, except a bit more realistic, except they don't have armor, which isn't realistic within Braveheart, but they look like rabble, which is pretty much what they are. These are tribes people, they're not a real standing army, they practice tribal warfare, so it makes sense that their coalition of armies would be very much scratch forces. Best comparison I could think of is the tribal forces in areas like Germania and in Gaul before the Romans conquered those areas. Knocking their history out of the way for this faction, let's look at the actual units themselves, starting with their general unit, the Champion Reavers. And here they are, and by God do they actually look really damn cool. So, unlike the other two factions that we looked at before, there's two general units available for this faction, and those two units are the Champion Reavers, which are the only heavy spear cavalry that the faction has available to them, and also Blood Avengers, I think, which are some of their heavy shock infantry, but we'll get to those later. Looking at the actual Champion Reavers, their horses are unarmored, which, fair enough, these are tribal people, you wouldn't expect them to have much in the way of barding. But as you can tell just by looking at them, you can definitely see the clear link between them and Isengard, which makes sense because they're allies of Isengard. Saruman and his forces using them as shock troops to tie down Rohan's resources and to pillage and burn. Looking at their armor specifically, their helmets are very clearly based off of the Uruk-hai helmets. In fact, I think they are Uruk-hai helmets. But I love that crest on them. And whenever I see this helmet, I'm always kind of reminded of a mix between a Viking helmet, what with the eye holes, and also of an ancient Greek hoplites helmet with a crest on it, except instead of a crest of horsehair or feathers, they've instead got as the metal crest, which suits the brutal aesthetic of Isengard and by extent Dunland well. They've got nasty looking spears, which are missing part of their blade, which I guess you could kind of say makes these more cutting spears rather than thrusting spears potentially. Whatever it is, they look like they'll definitely kill whatever they hit. They've got metal pauldrons on their arms, so they've got some protection there. They've got iron breastplates, crudely made, but even so, it's armor and it's quite a bit better than what they'd naturally have available to themselves. And underneath, I think they're wearing furs, which, okay, fair enough. They've got round shields. Historically, you'll find round shields just about everywhere, and I think these are more convex or concave. The one where it sticks out a little bit. This is what these shields are. They don't look exactly like flat round shields. They've got a scale pattern on them, which, yeah, I guess you'd probably find that an example of this historically somewhere. They're a fair size, so yeah, that'll give them fair enough defense. And now let's turn to their actual general unit. And yeah, he cuts an intimidating figure. He mixes the aesthetics of Isengard and Dunland, what with the armor of Isengard mixed with the wolf cloak of the Wildlands. Gives him a really nice appearance. His shield is one of the shields used by the Uruk-hai as a way of setting him apart from the rest of his troops. Looks very nice. Double as a weapon, what with those stabbing points, and I think you see that in the film when Aragorn gets his head trapped on a tree by Lurtz. For their blade, they've got a nice big scything blade that goes forward, and with that big tip at the end, I'm pretty sure that would be an armor-piercing blade. Just being hit in the side with that would be like getting hit with a pickaxe. So, all in all, that's quite a nasty-looking blade and a nasty-looking unit indeed. These guys definitely can break the lines of enemy forces if used correctly. They're not as heavy as other cavalry units, such as, say, the Rohirrim cavalry, the Riders of Rohan, or the Gondorian cavalry, such as the Swan Knights, and that is a faction we will eventually come to in the future, but even so, these guys can still make a mess of things in battle. Leaving them, let's move on to the melee infantry available to the faction. And here we have the Warlord's Bloodsworn. And you can see what I mean about the barbarian kind of aesthetic that they've given these units. What with all the furs, the long hair, the beards. They look like your stereotypical barbarians out of anything related to fiction. Now they've all got big wooden tower shields, which look like someone just broke off some floorboards, stuck some nails in them, and are now using them to defend themselves. Is that realistic? You definitely have tall shields like Pavisas that were used, but actual tower shields, in a way that is commonly depicted, I don't think those were really used in this kind of way. They were more of mobile field fortifications, more like self-protection. Apart from their shields, these guys all have clubs and maws, sometimes with spikes on them. That's quite realistic for a militia raised up of tribesmen. Not everyone will be expected to have swords or spears. Some of them will just have nice clubs and maws just made for smashing through whatever's in their path. Makes for an easier style of fighting that uses a lot less finesse and a lot less training, so it makes sense that they'll be equipped in such a way. Now, in terms of their armor, while they do have fur, some of them also have leather breastplates and corselets on them with metal inlaid. And yes, leather armor is a historical thing. I don't know if it's necessarily the most widespread thing in the way it appears in a lot of media, but it is something that definitely existed, as is fur. Because yeah, fur can actually stop blades a fair bit depending on how thick the fur is. So yeah, these guys do have somewhat armor protecting them. Their arms are bare, and most of them are lacking helmets, which makes them somewhat exposed to enemy fire and the rigors of frontline combat. But some of them do actually have helmets. Like this fellow here, he's wearing a skull cap with a nasal bar. Yeah, that'll give him some protection for his head. I mean, it's a pretty common helmet that was used a lot in history, such as, for example, by Norman Knight and militiamen, if they could get their hands on them. and sergeants and such for quite a while, so it makes sense that some of them would be able to get it in this unit. Let's see, apart from that, I can't really think of much else to say about this unit, except for the fact that while it is a melee unit that this faction has available to it, I have a feeling that in battle it will fare not quite as well compared to other medium melee infantry or heavy melee infantry. So for example, like Rohan's upper tiered infantry, I don't think these guys are going to stand that much of a chance against them. Let's look at their commanding officer. Okay, then I like this guy's aesthetic. I really do. He's also got the wolf head above his helmet, and he's rocking the Viking helmet, what with the eye holes inlaid or gilded with gold. But like that is showing off his wealth. He's got leather arm cuffs and arm braces, which those aren't really historical, or rather the really little cuffs that you see in films, those aren't historical. Having longer braces, that's quite a bit more plausible. He's wearing no armor or protection whatsoever on his chest, except for those wonderful blue tattoos, which remind me of the woad dyed of the Celtic tribes of Iron Age Britain, the forces that fought against the Roman Empire, such as the warriors led by the famous Boudica, like the Iceni tribes and all that, which again makes sense there, comparing, given that the historical basis for the depiction of these troops is based on the barbarian tribes of Europe. So yeah, it makes sense that this guy would have tribal tattoos. He's got the same round shield as the cavalry do, which makes sense. They're an elite unit. He's an elite warrior leading a unit of lower ranked warriors, so it makes sense he'll have a shield that makes him stand out a bit from the rest. He has pants, which is good to see, and he has, oh god, what is the name for this piece of armor that you wear over the tops of your legs? Yeah, there's a name for it, and it is really eluding me right now. And I'm pissed off that it's eluding me. I know it's not a skirt. Oh god. Look, if I remember it later on in the video, I'll mention it. But he's wearing protection for his upper legs, and it's leather with armor inlaid into it, which will give him some measure of protection. However, he's also got a Uruk-hai pauldron on his right shoulder to defend himself. So, while he cuts an intimidating figure, realistically, not wearing much in the way of chest armor for the most important part of your body, and only having a shield like this rather than a bigger one, he's not really that well prepared for combat, if you catch my drift. But yeah, it definitely looks intimidating with that wonderful wolf skin on him. So yeah, these are the warriors bloodsworn, and these guys will make up a fair portion of your army. Moving on to the stronger melee infantry, you have the Dunherd swordsmen, and these guys look pretty awesome, I'm not going to deny. Just look at them. They're all heavily armored. They're all wearing mail, head to toe. They've got boots on. They've got large one-handed sword blades, which have a hook on the end, so again, that armor piercing thing. I think that the units of Isengard also use this sword, at least some of them. They've got the shields of Isengard, just adds to their defensive value. They've got bones on the front of their chest, which I guess cutting through hard bone gives them an added layer of protection, but also makes them look more intimidating. They've got the Viking-looking helmets, eye holes, nasal bar, and they've got armor. They've got mail covering their entire face for some of them. Some of them have their face exposed. Others, like this guy, have an Aventail is the one at the back. I'm pretty sure. Is it No, not Saleh. Look, they've got chainmail around their face protecting their face. Got coif. Yeah, they've got a mail coif surrounding their face. So yeah, that makes for quite a lot of heavy protection. And just as a unit, and of course you've got the wolf heads on top, which make the entire image just come together. Now these guys as a unit, they're ultra impressive looking, and in battle they will be very useful. These will be your heavier line infantry. You won't be able to bring many of them to the battle, but you can definitely rely on these guys to make a mess of it in battle. Try and find their commanding officer. Okay. Their commanding officer is equipped much the same as the rest of his men, which makes sense. This is meant to be an elite unit made up of the more renowned warriors of Dunland. However, instead of a sword and a shield, he eschews that for a giant two-handed axe. And while these aren't realistic, at least not that massive with that massive of a head, it definitely looks intimidating and it looks cool. You cannot deny it. If you only had one side, I think it'd be a lot more realistic. It'd look a lot more similar to something like a more elaborate Dane axe. But with the second side added on the back, it doesn't look that realistic. But even so, he looks cool. You can't. There's no way out of it or around it. Pretty cool looking dude to look a pretty cool looking unit. Now then, let's move on to our next unit. Dunherd's Chosen. And these are a shock unit for the faction. As you can see, they've got an interesting aesthetic. They too have dropped most of their body armor, set to show off their awesome bodies and their tattoos, which intimidation factor, yes. Protection factor, not so much. They've got the same helmets as the others. They've got the same wolf heads mounted. I'm pretty sure the wolf population of Dunland is about to go extinct, given how much these guys like coating themselves with wolves. They've also got the metal pauldrons covering their upper arms. In some cases, like this guy, they've got the leather cuffs with metal inlaid. Which again, I spoke about that before. They've got the leather and metal inlaid things protecting their legs, whose name I am forgetting again, and I'm kicking myself, and please mention it in the comments, because I'm a bit of an idiot. Also, I'm recording this at like 2 in the morning, so if my historical knowledge seems a bit off, it's because I'm very tired. However, apart from their outfits and the giant axes that they're wielding, some of which look quite realistic, because there's nothing at the back of them. And then some of them have just smaller hooks on the back, which seem a lot more realistic than just chucking a giant double-bladed axe. So for example, this guy's weapon looks like you can hack down people in front of him pretty easily, but he can also hook and draw people around with the back of the axe, which is always useful. So unlike this guy's axe, which is just a big axe with nothing at the back of it, and he's clipping in and out of his team member. You have a feeling an axe coming into your head like that will still kill you regardless of whether or not you're swinging it at the guy. Looking back at them though, these guys are shock troops, you can probably guess given they're all equipped with giant axes. They're not the best in regards of defense, which most shock troops aren't, but for these guys I think it's even worse given they have very little in the way of defensive armor to protect themselves from incoming arrow fire. They'll definitely carve a hole through enemy formations, but you've got to be very careful with how you use them, just because they inherently lose to archers and skirmishers. Where is their commanding officer? Okay then, their commanding officer is equipped much the same as the leader of the... what are they called again? Of the Warlords Bloodsworn. He's equipped as the rest of his unit, except he doesn't have a giant axe. Instead he uses a sword and a shield. So much the same as we saw before. On to another one of the potential general units for the faction, the Blood Avengers. Again, these guys look bloody amazing. They're equipped in a mix of the armor of Dunland and Isengard, a fusion of both cultures, and they're armed with gigantic axes and bardishes and other pole arms, just ready to smash through formations. They've got the same elite Uruk-hai helmets, they've got the shoulder guards, they've got scale breastplates, which yeah, that gives them a fair bit of defense. Others have tegulated armor, I believe, or perhaps chainmail with metal plates added on top of it. They've also got those same leather braces. They do not wear gauntlets. I don't think any of the units in the faction wear gauntlets, even their most heavy soldiers. They don't use shields, obviously, but these guys are quite a bit stronger than the previous unit we were looking at. And yeah, in battle, if the other guys would make a mess of enemy formations, these guys will do even worse. And unlike the others, they can stand up to arrows that little bit better because they have far more armor. You know, they're actually protecting their chest for once. They've got mail protecting their groin area, also good. And I think their legs are unarmored. Yeah. Also, majestic beards. I think that's one phrase that you can use to sum up this entire faction. Just majestic beards. But also the dwarves too. And the men of Rohan. Not so much the men of Gondor though. He is their commanding officer. He actually looks even more different than the other commanding officers because he has a Uruk-hai helmet underneath the wolf pelt, which the others don't have. He's got the Uruk-hai breastplate, he's got the shoulder pieces, he's got the Uruk-hai shield, and he's got that curved sword. So yeah, another cool looking unit. I definitely like these guys. I think my fanboying for them kind of shows that off. Now let's look at the next unit of the faction, which will somewhat make up the bulk of your armies. The tribal warriors. And these guys have a lack of beards, which disappoints me greatly. Now these guys really fit up to the barbarian stereotype, wearing next to no armor, looking quite dirty and messy, and yeah, these guys aren't that much more effective than orcs in battle, and that kind of tells you something. Let's look at their actual equipment first. They've got round shields, similar to the stereotypical Saxon shields, except these are unpainted, unvarnished, they have nothing over them, they're just boards strapped together. They have no chest armor for the most part except sheepskins, which will give you some protection, but not really that much. Some of them don't even have anything and just have pieces of rusted away mail covering their upper body. I mean, props to them for trying to find armor and using it, but finding decayed armor in the ground isn't really going to be much of a defensive choice or option for you, I'd say, given that your arms are uncovered and your stomach is uncovered, but at least the shield can kind of help remedy that. Also, they're missing helmets, which puts them in a really bad position. For their weaponry, though, they seem to have axes for the most part. This guy has just got a cooking knife, meat splitter. Yeah, it'll do functionally in a battle. If you need something at hand to cut people with, it's better than nothing. Their axes have an interesting shape, though. They look very much similar with the aesthetic of orc blades, which makes sense. These guys are humans that are often in contact with the dark forces, including orcs. Over there you have that meat hatchet. These guys will be the bulk of your army. Don't expect them to do that much. They're very light infantry. They're very poorly armoured infantry, and they're not very well equipped infantry in regards to weaponry. They can fight, but there's definitely better options for sure. And their commanding officer is another one of those berserker looking guys, just wielding his tattoos and his shield. Now, I actually forgot to mention this. Going back to the Dunherd Chosen, while they also have their big axes, they also have something else. Smaller throwing axes, forgot to mention that before. It doubles as a melee unit and as a ranged unit. You can throw axes at your enemy to break up their formation a bit, kill a couple of their soldiers, and then throw these guys into the mix with those massive axes. Okay then, I remembered what I was going to say. We'll move on to the next unit after the tribal warriors. Tribal levies. And these guys are another unit that will make up the bulk of your faction, and they're quite cheap. And their cheap price is reflected in their quality, because there's not much in the way of it. They are similarly equipped to the Axemen. They have furs, little else. Some of them have leather breastplates and corselets. Some of them have the leather wrist guards, but that's about it. Some have chainmail that's rusted away protecting them. And they've also got the same round shields for an added modicum of protection. These guys are chaff. They will be whittled away by any competent archer force. And in a clash of soldiers, these guys also won't do that great against the enemy. Their weapons actually are quite interesting. They've got a levied mix of weapons. Some of them have, for example, scythes, which was a common weapon when used by militias who didn't have access to anything better. Some of them have spears with quite a bladed shape, more of a glaive kind of device. That looks a fair bit more effective. Some of them also have these giant... I don't really know what to call this, because it looks like a really crappy polearm merged with a mace. Now, I don't know if this is a historical weapon. I don't even know if this would be effective. And they come in some different varieties. Some of them have lots of spikes, some of them are smaller spiked bores. They look interesting, but I really don't know if these are historical. I wouldn't think so, but with all the weird weapons that have existed in history, it's quite plausible that these might have existed, even though I might completely be wrong on that. Yeah, these are definitely interesting. Their commanding officer, same looking dude. Let's move on to their more upgraded version of their spearmen, the Elder Spearmen. And as you can see, all the guys in this unit are greybeards, old salted hands, who have lived a life of battle and have reaped the rewards because they've lived to an older age and they've equipped themselves with far better equipment. They've all got these spears for the most part. Yeah. So they're quite a bit more standardized than the rest of the warriors of Dunland. The spears look like cutting blades. They've also got the angular geometry that a lot of the orc weapons have in Lord of the Rings, which I quite like, but they've also got the more mechanized appearance that Isengard has compared to the other dark factions, which makes even more sense as far as I'm concerned. In regards to their shields, they've got those same scale looking shields, so I'm guessing these are just wooden shields covered in bronze scales, which, okay, that makes them quite a bit more defensible. For their chests, they've got, I can't tell if that's fur covered in metal plates, like that big circular gold plate. Yeah, it is. So they've got fur protecting them, which isn't exactly the best defensive option, but when you don't have anything, what little you can get your hands on works. And above that, they place round metal circles to protect the top of their chest. And these actually do have a place in history, specifically in the soldiers of the early Roman Republic. A lot of the Hastati would wear these types of metal balls on their chest for lack of better armor, and because they were using large shields, they didn't need to fully equip themselves. So it makes sense that these guys share a similar form of defensive armor in conjunction with their large shields. They've also got effective Urukai shoulder guards. They've got the same cuffs on their arms. Their legs are unarmored, I'm pretty sure. And one thing they're all missing though are helmets. So I'm surprised that many of them lived to reach this age and haven't found a helmet. But maybe the people of Dunlend just do things differently. I do wish these guys would have had helmets, though. It would have added to their more elite status. So yeah, these guys will be a cornerstone of your army for sure, given that they can hold back the enemy quite well. And they'll be a nightmare for cavalry to deal with from the front. Where is their commanding officer? Here he is. He stands out quite a bit from the rest of his troops, given he's lacking any chest armor whatsoever. His blade is kind of a falchion. Yeah, we'll go with that. Kind of suits him. That's most of it for the units. Let's move on to their ranged units, starting off with their tribal hunters. These are the lowest archers that the unit can field. They're equipped much the same way as the rest of their warriors, wearing furs and scattered bits of chainmail if they can get their hands on it. They're equipped with what I'd say, they're not longbows, I'd just say maybe short bows. They could be longbows, I'm not too sure. These archers aren't that good, but at a pinch they'll do a job. They definitely don't compare to the more military oriented factions archers like Rohan's garrisonable warriors or the Gondorian line archers with their heavy plate, and they definitely do not compare to the elven warriors when it comes to skill with bows, but then again, that's not these guys' role. Also lacking helmets, which seems to be a common thread with this faction. Their commanding officer is another one of the wolf-wearing warriors lacking any chest protection. We'll move up to their next type of archer, Elder Archers. And these guys are equipped in much the same way as the Elder Spearmen, except this time they've traded out a spear for a longbow. These bows definitely look quite a bit longer than the ones wielded by the tribal archers. Got the exact same arm, I'm not going to go over it. These guys can take a hit better than the others can, but again they're also missing helmets, which puts them at a bit of a disadvantage compared to more heavily armoured archers. Their commanding officer is somewhere. Here he is. And yet equipped just the same as the other officers. And then we'll move to their most elite archers, the Dunherd archers. And these guys, they're pretty good. They're covered in mail head to toe, they've got the bone armor, breastplate kind of, they've got the wolf heads for intimidation, they've got the Viking helmets, and they've got Uruk-hai bows. These are the bows that you see them use in Fellowship of the Ring. I believe one of these is used to kill Boromir in the films. And these are recurve bows, I'm pretty sure. Quite nasty, quite powerful. These guys will do well in battle against other archers. Even so, they're not quite up to the task as the most effective archers of other factions, but these guys will definitely do a better job than their fellow men. Also, you can throw these guys into melee somewhat, because they do have greater armor than the others, who would be shoot up in a fight pretty quickly. So that's something else you can use this unit for. And that is the last of the archers that the men of Dunland can field. However, they do have more ranged units than just these guys. They have their tribal youths, and these guys are really about as poor as you can go. It's no armor for the most part at all. Some of them just have rags. I can't tell if that's meant to be mail or it's just dirt. Like, look at that. It looks like nothing. It looks like the guy's covered in dirt just on his chest. It might be an incredibly rotted away piece of clothing, but I cannot tell. Some of them just don't have anything. They've all got to have the leather arm braces though, that goes without saying. No helmet, some of them do have kind of that peasant's cap and chest thing that you often see in films and in historical paintings. So that's something that kind of reflects the fact that these guys are peasant levies, or more tribal levies rather than peasants, but you get the idea. They've got the same round shields, that's something I guess. And they've got javelins. And that's about all these guys really have at their disposal. As you can probably guess, these guys are short-range skirmisher units. If these guys get in the way of archers, they will be absolutely decimated by them. Their armor is practically nothing, and they can't return fire with archers either. So definitely try and keep these guys out of the enemy's archer range and use them in a more smart manner. Also, don't throw them into melee combat either. These guys are not Pelagia Marines. They're not any of the better skirmisher units that can double as melee warriors. These guys will die in the hundreds if you try using them in that way. However, when you don't have much money left in your coffers, sometimes you've got to make do with what's available, and these guys are quite cheap. Where's the commanding officer? Another Wolfman. Won't comment, you've seen him before. We'll move on to the Dunherd cavalry. And these are their marauders, these are melee cavalry, and they're armoured, or should I say not armoured, much the same as the other wolf warriors, lacking any chest protection, but they've got shoulder protection for some of them. They've got their little leather cuffs, and they don't use swords. They use the same axes that the other soldiers use, of different types. Some of them have more hatchet, some of them have this more orc-shaped blade, but none of them seem to use swords at all, which makes sense. They live in an area where there's not much in the way of metal, so they have to do without. Their horses are unarmoured too, also makes sense. If you can't afford to armour yourself, you're not going to be able to afford to armour your horses. They've got the same metal shields, which give them some defensive value. And where is their commanding officer? No, that's not him. Is this him? Yes, it is. This is their commanding officer, and you can tell him apart because he's the only one with a blade. And he has, he's just as equipped as the rest of his unit, except he has this falchion-looking hacking blade, which looks quite similar to the cleavers wielded by the Uruk-hai, which again makes sense because of the inter-community relations that both factions have. These guys are not the match of the other cavalry in Middle-earth, such as the Rohirrim, but they'll serve their purpose if you know how to use them correctly, throwing them in at the right points. As you can probably guess, Dunhurt doesn't have that much in the way of cavalry, but as a faction it's kind of well rounded. They also have skirmisher cavalry, which not many factions have. They don't have bow cavalry, unfortunately, but as a result they have cavalry that fights at a shorter range, which makes them a bit more vulnerable to enemy cavalry, especially as they're so lightly armoured that in a clash of cavalry with these guys, it's not going to go well for them. They have the same round shields as many of the other warriors in the faction. They wear the same sheepskins. Their arms are bare, or they wear these chainmail pieces, leather cuffs, pants, and actually nice looking javelins. Yeah, their javelins don't look monstrous compared to the rest of some of their equipment. And you'd probably guess what they do with these javelins on horseback. They throw them into enemy formations. Oh, some of them do have helmets. They've got the same skull caps. These guys don't throw them into melee. Keep them back, chuck the spears. Then you can maybe charge the enemy rear, but even so, they won't be the best unit to do it with. Let's see their general. Okay, he's just another man with a wolf head and no chest armor. Seen him once, seen him a million times. Now, one thing this faction does have that I really do like are the Warlords of Wolf Tamers. And you can't deny, these guys look amazing. And the big Paparinos, as they were, also look amazing. Like, wouldn't you like to give this guy just a pat? And this is a custom design, because before I'm pretty sure they were just using the stock standard dog design, which looked like molasses or pipples. And now they've got something that really accurately represents the faction. It's big wolves. And with these guys on the way, that means that you then know that the developers are creating wargs, which will just be bigger versions of these. So it's good to see the first steps towards something greater happening. Their wolf tamers can also fight in battle, which I quite like. They're armed with either Urukai falchions, or just falchions in general, short swords, cleavers. Yeah, these guys will be able to enter combat fairly well. They've all got leather corselets at the very least. Some of them have leather breastplates. All realistic armor, although it wasn't exactly as widespread as everyone assumes. They've got tattoos as well. They've got the iron shields, or bronze shields, whatever the hell they are. I just love the sound of those dogs running in the background, or should I say wolves in the background. And they're missing helmets, which I kind of get, because you're not really expecting these guys to be thrown into battle, given that they're meant to release wolves to break up the enemy formations, which these guys do. They break up enemy formations if you use them the right way, especially if you're attacking from behind. If you throw them against cavalry, they actually do quite well too, depending on if the cavalry's charging. If the cavalry's charging, you're just going to see a lot of speared wolves, but if the cavalry's stationary, these guys can mess them up quite a bit. So yeah, this is what I probably call the most unique unit that Dunlend can field, and it's probably my favourite unit, just for the sake of the wolves. I'm a big fan, what can I say? Before we move on to the final unit, we'll talk about the actual role of using wolves in battle. Now, war dogs are a very common thing in history. In fact, there's one, I think his name is El Becerrillo, or something like that, El Becerrillo, who fought in the wars against the Aztecs by the Spanish, and this war dog killed literally hundreds of enemy warriors. The people of Dunlend, they haven't given their warhounds, or war wolves in this case, any armor, like was sometimes done in real life. But even in real life, dogs were used without armor, so it makes sense that here you have creatures fighting that don't wear armor. Now, using wolves specifically as your force, the only way I can say that's historically plausible is if you go back to the time of the domestication of wolves and their transition to dogs. I can't think of anywhere in history, at least in recorded history, where actual wolves have been trained as a attack force. Dogs, yes. Wolves, not so much. Definitely an interesting unit nonetheless. We'll move on to their final unit, and they have onagers. Their crew are just as lightly armoured as the rest of the faction, and With the onagers, this faction has siege capabilities, which is good. They can attack enemy fortifications, knock down holes in their walls, and pour in their units. And because their units are so large in regards to their numbers, it means that this faction often runs at a numerical superiority to their enemy. So you can put those numbers to good use in battle. Then, of course, like most onagers, the problem is that if you're fighting factions who use much better artillery, like trebuchets, or the larger onagers that are available to some factions, these get outclassed pretty damn quickly. But for the most part, they're good enough to be put to good use. I can't say too much more about them, and I guess that kind of is the end of the unit breakdown for this faction. So let's look at Dunland overall and talk about them. My final thoughts and overview for the faction. I like that it's a fully fleshed out faction. The creators didn't have much in the way of material from the films, but they definitely gave them a unique flavour, and using inferences have created quite the faction. I'm a fan of them. Now, I wouldn't really play them, because while I do like the idea of Dunland, I'm a bigger fan of Gondor and Rohan and the Easterlings, but they're definitely a cool faction nonetheless. They play quite a bit more closer to orc factions than they do men, just because of their numbers. So always keep that in mind. Quality won't really be something that this faction often possesses in comparison to their enemies, but numbers is where this faction's strength lies. And they can field cavalry, which is something that not too many of the evil factions can currently say. Overall, cool faction, cool designs, and if you like this video, please make sure to like and subscribe. I will be making a new video in the future, and in fact I've got a new series on the way that's currently in production. I don't know when that will get to you, but it will get to the channel someday. Our next faction, I'm not too sure what it is, but nevertheless I will make sure it is an excellent video just like this one. Well people, this is Jackoff signing out. Have a wonderful day. Bye.